Inflation is at a 40-year high, and with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, gas and food are likely to become even more expensive for Americans. These issues are framing how Republican lawmakers are viewing President Biden's first year in office. Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota is my next guest and a member of several important committees, including banking, budget, veterans affairs, armed services. And I spoke with Senator Cramer before Russia invaded Ukraine. Take a listen.
Senator Cramer, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been looking forward to talking to you. You know, this is our annual time we like to take a snapshot of America's report card. You've got President Biden who's going to come, give a State of the Union address. But I kind of like to do the real State of the Union, have, alternative views that sort of look at what's going well, what's not going well. And right now, I mean, the headline for me is the price of, peanut butter and steak and basic food, and inflation has gone crazy, and a lot of folks didn't see it coming. I'd love to get, an understanding of how you're looking at the economy right now, and whether or not you share my concerns about regular folks and what they're buying.
Well, for sure, I care about regular folks and what they're buying. One of the things, though, I think, for full disclosure, that's somewhat unique coming from North Dakota is we produce two of the most important things that the world needs. And one of them is food, and the other one, of course, is fuel. So being the number two producer of oil, number one producer of wheat, and about 10 or 11 other crops, and, a whole bunch of food for a hungry world. In other words, we're a commodity-based economy. So
right.
if you're in one of those industries that produces the economy, inflation works pretty well for you. If you're getting $16 a bushel for your soybeans, you don't like the cost of diesel, to plant them and to harvest them, but you do like the price at the elevator. If you're an oil producer or work out in the Bakken as part of the value chain for the oil and gas industry, $95
right.
Barrel oil does pretty well for you. All of that said, everybody's a consumer, and the inflation issue is the issue. There's no question. The economy is almost always one of the top two or three issues, at least people's individual economies. As long as things are going well, they don't worry a lot about the economy. But when things are going poorly, like they are now, and inflation, of course, being the biggest problem, it's on everybody's mind. I hear it the most from people back home, even in our very rich commodity cycle there in North Dakota.
Well, Senator, I know that inflation is, one of these things they said was transitory, going to go away, pretty quickly. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. But one thing that has been with us, and I just want to be candid and upfront, I think President Trump contributed a lot to it, is the national debt is driving higher and higher and higher. And I think there are senators like Senator Manchin that have been expressing concerns about the debt, but the GOP used to be the guardian of concern about the debt. How are things on that front?
Yeah, so really up until the pandemic, even though spending was up, the economy was growing at a pace as well, or maybe better in terms of the economy. I mean, productivity of the economy, gross domestic product. And really ever since the Budget Act a number of years ago, the discretionary side of the ledger has been pretty steady or even just a little bit lower. That all got blown up in the pandemic. I mean, we were flying airplanes while we were building them. Nobody was arguing with the appropriations that we were putting out just to help keep the economy afloat. Of course, the Fed behavior, monetizing everything they can, providing more capital, adding to their balance sheet. Everybody just sort of accepted that for about a year, without, they always knowing that at some point we're going to have to deal with the debt that comes with that. But in the short time, this was the risk we had to take. However, as we were coming out, even after the election, we're coming out of the pandemic, heading into 2021. It just seems that Democrats with their 50-50 Senate majority and their slight majority in the House and the presidency could not resist adding fuel to the fire of the economy. And they were warned by many people that another $2 trillion, as they put into the American Rescue Plan, this was not the time to do it. It was going to be bad. They insisted on doing it, and it was bad. And so because of that, what I believe was a major political error on their, on their part, they tend to own inflation. Now, you tend to own it anyway when you're in charge of everything, even if there's some blame by the previous administration and previous Republican Congress, there's just no question that that was an error that gave them the mantle for inflation. And then the Fed has also been equally slow. You use the word transitory. That was a term that I think Jay Powell regrets ever using, and he wanted to pivot away from it, as you know, recently. And he's, of course, up for reconfirmation as chairman for a second term of the Federal Reserve. I talk to him pretty regularly. And if they would have started easing easing and even just slight interest rates earlier, slower, it would have been a much less painful recovery for interest rates. Unfortunately, or for inflation, unfortunately, they did not do that. Like any problem that you delay, the fix becomes more dramatic. So there are a lot of things that could have been avoided and that they were warned about by a number of people that they didn't heed. And now they don't. And on top of that, on the supply side of things, well, when you stop the development of important geopolitical infrastructure like the XL pipeline and make yourself more reliant on other people's oil, and then you stop drilling or stop permitting on federal lands, just a lot of unforced errors that they made that have contributed, and as a result, they really do own. They, being the Democratic brand, really does own this inflation.
Well, I mean, you raise a really interesting and important moment at what may be a real key geopolitical inflection point. We don't know at the time of our talking right now what's going to happen with Russia, what's going to happen with Nord Stream 2. We do know that the Germans gave up a lot of nuclear power plants, so they're a lot more energy dependent they are now. And one of America's sources of power in the world has been, and the reason we are so engaged in the world, a lot of it has to do with the flow of energy. To allies and ourselves, the peaceful flow of trade, of energy, and we achieved energy independence in this country. At least I think we've still got it. Maybe thanks to North Dakota and Fargo and everything going on there. But it raises this really interesting question of how we responsibly, and I would hope a bipartisan way, look at the balance of equities of being environmentally sound and smart about the future, but also not forfeiting energy assets. And I just love to ask you, is that something you think deeply about?
Well, it is, Steve. And here's the thing. Herein lies what I believe could be Joe Biden's greatest opportunity. They talk about BBB, it's gone, it's blown up, it's never coming back. But they also talk about, what about a climate package? What about the climate part of BBB? Is there something to be done there? To which I say, as long as you start with a white sheet of paper and Joe Manchin at the helm, I think we can have a bipartisan geopolitical discussion about increments that take advantage of American-made energy and American-made innovation, working in partnership with our European allies in a trade way that further, that dilutes Vladimir Putin's captivity of the rest of Europe in terms of an energy market. And recognizes that American-made energy, even whether it's fossil energy, nuclear energy, to your point about Germany, or for that matter, other renewable energies that aren't so dependent on China's value chain and supply chain. I think together we can agree on some things. You might have seen just before Christmas, General H.R. McMaster and I wrote an op-ed that's talked about a geopolitical solution that where the United States and Europe could come together and sort of co-op along with sort of along the lines of their carbon club. They have a border adjustment. I think that a tariff of some sort that sets a standard that the United States and Europe meets, that Russia and China do not meet, addresses the climate issue and the greenhouse gas emissions issue at a global level where it should be addressed with American and European solutions. I just think it's one of those target-rich areas where there can actually be buy-in on a bipartisan basis. And I'd say sometimes it's dangerous for me even just to talk about it, but I like talking about it because
it does raise this interesting question of whether there are deals that are possible that include, hydrogen, that include gas, include fossils, but include wind, include other elements of that package. One of the things that I've learned, frankly, Senator, which in the nuclear area, is we're like experimenting with Bill Gates's new, nuclear facility ideas, smaller nuclear reactors, et cetera. The fuel from that doesn't come from the United States. Guess where it comes from? Russia. Right. And while we're criticizing the Germans on Nord Stream 2, we're dependent on Russian nuclear fuel. Right. It's like kind of, let's make headlines with that, folks. You can tweet it out. It's a big question mark we should be looking at. But let me just go, one step further. So, I think that you just said something really important, which is there's an opportunity for bipartisan climate work attached to, diverse energy solutions. It could, if you look at GE, for instance, GE has nuclear, GE has hydrogen, GE has wind too. And so that kind of packaging is something that a guy from North Dakota could possibly support.
I could sure get on board with discussing it. In fact, GE has a very large wind turbine blade factory in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And North Dakota also has a lot of wind. When I was an energy regulator, I cited a lot of it, and a lot more of it's been built since then. There's no question in all of the energy area, the one of the big challenge we have, solar, 75% of the supply chain for solar comes from China. And we just have to cut off China. I mean, that sounds dramatic, but we should not be so dependent. We can bring a lot of that supply chain home. Now, we have to agree, as Republicans and Democrats on some things, including the mining of the critical minerals, everything from uranium to lithium for batteries, and all of that exists in the United States. We actually have so much higher environmental standards as well as far as workplace and labor standards. We really can do better. It'll be a little more expensive, perhaps, but I think in the long run, it's the right thing for the climate. It's the right thing for our economy. It's the right thing for global and national security. And this is what I mean by, I think we need to start talking with our geopolitical allies on some sort of a trade basis, a geopolitical solution that recognizes how much better we can be doing some of the things that we've acquiesced over time. I mean, there's no reason in the world why we have to get uranium from Russia. I mean, we invented this thing, but over the years, we've let that slip away. We can bring a lot of that back. And by the way, Steve, that also means that the manufacturing process for a whole bunch of other things, the supply chain for a whole bunch of other things can be brought back into, and I don't want to hog it all. Obviously, we don't have the workforce for all of that, but it should be at least brought into the family of freedom-loving countries. And then through that process, we can do the things that otherwise require some sort of arms race. I'd rather have an innovation race.
Let me ask you finally, and I would address this to leading Republicans and leading Democrats and the president himself. I interviewed George Will earlier today, and George made the comment. He said, we're living in a very weird time where free enterprise, trade, belief in innovation and capitalism and the moral benefits of capitalism, which have raised just hundreds of millions of people from poverty. 42% in 1981 of the people in the world were living in extreme poverty. Today it's 10%. He said there are very few defenders of these principles within the Republican Party today. That's before you begin looking at who might pop up in the Democratic side. But I would ask, what should our North Star be? And not in a partisan way, but it just sort of looks like some of the principles we had that kind of move the nation forward have been derailed because of concerns about inequality, because sort of one side being unfair to the other. I'd just love to get your insights as a person who cares about these issues, what we might do to, steady the ship.
Yeah, so George Will is right on point, I think. And I know you can't steady the ship. You certainly can't turn the ship around until you steady it. And so it's always going to be an incremental approach, I suppose. But first thing we have to do is recognize what you just said and what George Will said. And that is that what made us great in the first place was freedom. And that we've eroded that a little bit at a time over time, sometimes necessarily, whether it was the early labor movement, some regulatory things that if left to the vices sometimes of complete unhinged capitalism, we maybe wouldn't be in as good a place. But all of that said, those foundations are still what made America better and more competitive. And this is why you'll hear me always stress, unleashing innovation rather than regulation. I think when it comes to just personal freedoms, in fact, even we need to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation, even within our own government. Quite honestly, we don't allow risk taking anymore. It's not, we want people to take risks, but then once a risk doesn't turn out, we want to punish the hell out of them, and we've got to kind of restore that attitude. I think that innovation really is the solution, but it's hard to do that when you're constrained by so much government, so much bureaucracy, so much risk aversion, which is the result of all of the things that you've talked about. And we have created so much bureaucracy around energy and the environment, so much bureaucracy about food processing, the manufacturing process, and labor. And what's happened is we've then acquiesce, or we really transfer a lot of productivity to places like China, who don't have any of our values.
Right.
They're not only unregulated, they're controlled. And so you have people working in sweatshops and basically slave labor. And we benefit from that in terms of buying cheap stuff. But it's really, for the other thing we need to do, quite honestly, since you brought it up, is we need to start teaching this stuff again in our institutions of education and higher learning, because, let's face it, we now have elected officials. We have United States senators who don't mind using the word socialism, even considering themselves as democratic socialists. That is a far cry from what George Will was talking about. And I'd love in our global society, and let's face it, we are dependent on each other. We are 20% of the world's economy. We're only 5% of the world's population. We're big consumers, but most of the world lives somewhere else. We need each other on a global basis. So, you can't unilaterally, disarm yourself and for example, in trade deals and all. It's complex. I don't want to oversimplify it, is my main point. But at the same time, we've lost a lot by sort of forgetting that North Star, that compass.
I'm going to squeeze in one last one here. I think if you look at honestly at both parties, the constituents in both parties, there are groups in both parties that have felt demeaned, mishandled, kind of left behind. You might look at issues of race that have driven a lot of politics. Now you might look at the issue of a lot of working class Americans that fought for this country, who felt like we fought the Cold War and China won. And you see a lot of people in this toxic time kind of broadcasting to each other. I'm just wondering how we get back to listening to each other, caring for it, realize we're on the same ship. And I know it's a big question, and you're up in North Dakota. I don't know what the situation is there, but it does raise the question of how we get back to hearing one another and then trying to kind of figure it out. Is how much of that may happen among your colleagues, that kind of discussion up in the gym?
It needs to happen more often. I don't, to be honest with you, I don't worry so much about how members of Congress communicate and relate to one another. I worry more about the people we work for, because we really, at the end of the day, the politics is driven by the populace. So I think one of the things, Steve, is more members need to spend more time on talk radio back home. I do a couple of hours a week, and they need to talk to their own constituents, because from time to time, first of all, you need to listen. But then occasionally it's important for you to help persuade as well. And that takes earning political capital with your constituents, just like you do here, and then sharing some of it back. I'll give you one example. And I just did an interview on the subway coming over here. This issue of President Biden indicating right out of the chute or during the campaign that his first Supreme Court nominee needs to be a Black woman. Now, you see people in my party that are all up in arms about it, seizing that, that criteria as somehow bad in and of itself. And to which I'd say, well, if this was 100 years ago and you couldn't find a Black woman lawyer qualified to be on the Supreme Court, maybe you could have something to argue about. But the reality is, there are a whole bunch of Black women that are qualified to be on the Supreme Court. What's wrong with that being one of the criteria when there's never been one? Why wouldn't we celebrate that? That's how I feel. And I know when I talk like this, some people look at me cross-eyed, but I like to challenge.
No, it's heartening. It's heartening, actually. I mean, it's heartening to hear somebody getting out of their, comfortable groove.
I also don't think that that person, whoever they are, should be given an easier road to confirmation because they are a Black woman. But I don't expect that to be the case. We got to celebrate that, and then hold them just as accountable for all the other things that do matter, like like your your qualifications, your education, your judicial philosophy and demeanor. All those things matter, and then you're honoring each other in a way that. But I also think this conversation we're having right now is part of the contribution, Steve. And I think we need to do a whole lot more of that. Look, I can be as partisan as anybody, but I think generally when I am, it's based on a real philosophy or a strong conviction that I have. Certainly not on the person's political party affiliation. But there's no question we ought to get our smile back. First of all, I've said that often. We shouldn't be so angry. Anger is not a real great quality. And if we do that, we can be a lot more productive. One of the other problems is that I think that the media, by and large, social media in particular, 24-hour cable, whether it's on the right or on the left, it has just done more to divide people and to provide lanes for comfort zones for people. And that just doesn't allow for the uncomfortable, conversations across political spectrums.
Yeah. Well, Senator Kevin Cramer, I think your video's gone out. I'm going to tell my producers to leave every word that you said in this. It's been a delight talking to you. Really fascinating. And I would love to have this conversation with you anytime. So thank you so much for joining us.
Let's do it again soon. Thank you.